My wife stood in the middle of my father's living room holding a yellowed envelope in her hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she looked at me and said the words that changed everything. I wasn't going to tell you about this. The envelope carried my father's handwriting. Father had been dead for 12 years. Hands started shaking before I even opened it, because deep down, I already knew. Whatever was inside that envelope was something I was never supposed to see. And judging by the fear in my wife's eyes, she knew it too. Let me take you back to how it all started. My name is Daniel Harper. I was 64 years old when I discovered the biggest betrayal of my life. Not from a stranger, not from a business partner, not even from a dishonest relative. It came from the woman I had been married to for 36 years, my wife Susan. For most of our marriage, I believed we were a team. We raised 2 children together, built a comfortable life, survived financial struggles, worked through illnesses, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. From the outside, we looked like a successful family, but looking back now, I realized there were warning signs I ignored for years. My father, Arthur Harper, was a simple man. He worked as a mechanic for nearly 50 years. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't educated, but he understood people better than anyone I ever met. When I was young, he taught me a lesson I never forgot. He used to say, "Pay attention when people think nobody is watching. That's when they show you who they really are." At the time, I thought he was talking about honesty. Years later, I learned he was talking about loyalty. My mother died when I was 27. After that, my father lived alone. I visited every weekend, sometimes with Susan, sometimes by myself. The relationship between my father and Susan was always polite, never warm, never close, just polite. Told myself that was enough. Not everyone becomes best friends with their in-laws, I accepted that, but there was always a strange tension between them. Whenever my father offered advice, Susan would smile and nod, then ignore it completely. Whenever he shared family stories, she seemed bored. Whenever he talked about tradition, she rolled her eyes when he wasn't looking. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just small moments. Easy to dismiss, easy to excuse. So I did, for years. When my father reached his late 70s, his health began declining. He remained mentally sharp, but physically, he struggled. I started spending more time helping him, taking him to appointments, buying groceries, fixing things around his house. Susan often complained about it, not directly, never directly. Instead, she would say things like, "You're spending a lot of time over there lately," or "Your father needs to learn independence." I understood her frustration, or at least I thought I did. At the time, I believed she was worried about me. Now I know she was worried about something else. 2 years before my father died, he invited me over one evening, just me. No Susan, no grandchildren, no distractions. We sat on his back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees for a long time. Neither of us spoke, then he said something unusual. "Promise me something," I laughed. "Depends what it is." His expression didn't change. "I'm serious." That got my attention. I nodded. "Okay." He stared out toward the yard. "If anything ever seems wrong after I'm gone, don't ignore it." I frowned. "What does that mean?" He shrugged. "Probably nothing." Then he changed the subject. At the time, I thought it was just old age, a man thinking about mortality, nothing more. I never imagined those words would haunt me for over a decade. My father passed away peacefully. 6 months later, heart failure. No warning, no final conversation, no chance to ask questions. One day he was there. The next day he wasn't. Losing him felt like losing the last solid foundation beneath my feet. The funeral was difficult. Hundreds of people attended. Former co-workers, neighbors, friends, family, everyone had a story about Arthur Harper. Everyone respected him. During the reception afterward, I noticed something strange. Several people asked me about the will. At first I thought nothing of it. Then the questions kept coming. What did your father leave you? Did everything get sorted out? Was the property situation resolved? I didn't understand why everyone seemed so interested, because according to Susan, there was no real will. She told me my father had died without one. Everything had supposedly transferred through a simple legal process. The house had eventually been sold, the money divided, the estate closed, simple, clean, finished. At least that's what I believed. Susan handled most of the paperwork during that period. I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife, the person I trusted more than anyone, the person who was supposed to protect me. Over the years, life moved on. Our children grew older, grandchildren arrived, retirement came, and my father's memory slowly settled into that quiet place where old grief lives, never gone, just quieter. But every once in a while, something felt off, a comment, a memory, a detail that didn't quite fit. One afternoon, nearly 8 years after his death, I mentioned my father during a family dinner. My daughter smiled and said, "Grandpa always said the family land should stay in the family." The statement surprised me, because the small piece of land behind my father's house had been sold almost immediately after his death. I looked at Susan. She quickly changed the subject. At the time, I let it go. Again. That became a pattern. Questions appeared, then disappeared. Every time I got close to examining them, life distracted me. Years passed. Then came the event that changed everything. 12 years after my father's death, our oldest grandson graduated from college. The family gathered to celebrate. Children ran through the backyard. Music played. People laughed. For a few hours, everything felt normal. Then my sister Carol pulled me aside. She looked nervous, uncomfortable, like someone carrying a secret. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" She hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Did you ever read Arthur's final will?" The question hit me like a punch. I stared at her. "What will?" Her face went pale, and in that moment, I realized she knew something I didn't, something important, something that should have been impossible, because, according to everything I had been told for the last 12 years, there had never been a will at all. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I stared at my sister, convinced I had misunderstood her. "What do you mean, what will?" she asked. "The will Susan told me about years ago. Arthur's final will." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. My father's final will, not a rumor, not a possibility. A specific document, a document I had never seen. I forced a smile and tried to sound calm. "Carol, Dad didn't leave a will." The moment those words left my mouth, her expression changed completely. Confusion, then disbelief, then concern. "Daniel." "Yes, he did." My heart started pounding. "What are you talking about?" She looked around to make sure nobody was listening. Then she lowered her voice. "I was there when he signed it. Everything around me seemed to fade into the background. Children were laughing nearby. Music was playing, people were talking, but all I could hear was my sister's voice. "You saw it?" "Yes, when?" "A few months before he died." I felt suddenly lightheaded. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her face tightened. "Because Susan told everyone you already knew." I didn't respond. I couldn't. 12 years. 12 years believing one version of events. And now, in less than 60 seconds, that version was falling apart. Carol reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph. It showed my father sitting at a kitchen table. Beside him was a lawyer, and sitting directly across from him was Susan. The picture wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it raised questions I couldn't ignore. Questions that should have been answered years ago. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my living room. The house was quiet. Susan was upstairs getting ready for bed. For the first time in our entire marriage, I found myself wondering what else I didn't know. I thought about my father's warning on the porch. "If anything ever seems wrong after I'm gone, don't ignore it." At the time, those words had seemed meaningless. Now they sounded like a message I should have listened to years earlier. The next morning, I called Carol. We talked for nearly 2 hours. What she told me made my stomach turn. According to her, my father had specifically wanted the family land. Preserved, not sold, not divided. preserved. The land wasn't large, only 12 acres, but it had belonged to our family for generations. My grandfather worked that land. My great-grandfather worked that land. To my father, it represented family history, family identity, family legacy. Carol remembered him talking about it repeatedly. He was worried someone would sell it after he died, she said. That's why he created the will. I sat silently, because the land had been sold less than a year after his death. Sold quickly, sold quietly, and apparently against his wishes. The more Carol talked, the more uncomfortable I became. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding. Did Susan ever discuss the will with you? Carol hesitated, then answered, Yes. My chest tightened. What did she say? She told me not to bring it up because everything had already been handled. The room felt smaller. Every answer created 3 new questions. By the end of the call, I knew one thing for certain. I needed the truth, not assumptions, not memories, not suspicions, facts. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Simply wanted to know whether any trace of the will existed. A clerk helped me search old estate records. The process took hours. Most of it led nowhere. Then she found something, a filing, reference small, almost insignificant but real, my father's. Estate file contained documentation referencing a will, not the will itself, just a reference. Number, proof that it had existed. Stared at the screen. My hands felt numb. Because at that moment, the question was no longer whether a will existed. The question had become, why had someone worked so hard to convince me it didn't? When I arrived home that evening, Susan was sitting at the kitchen table reading a magazine. She smiled when I walked in. A normal smile. The same smile I had trusted for 36 years. For the first time in my life, I found myself wondering if it was real. I sat across from her. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. What happened? I looked directly into her eyes. Then I asked a single question. Susan, did my father leave a will? The color drained from her face. And for the first time since this started, she didn't answer right away. Susan stared at me for several long seconds. The magazine slowly slipped from her hands onto the table. For the first time in 36 years, I saw something I had never seen in her eyes before. Fear, not confusion, not surprise. Fear. Finally, she looked away, and that told me everything. Where did you hear that? She asked quietly. I didn't answer. Instead, I repeated the question. Did my father leave a will? Her shoulders sank, then she whispered, Yes, one word. That was all it took. 12 years of lies collapsed in a single second. I felt angry. But more than that, I felt tired. Tired of not knowing. Tired of doubting myself. Tired of realizing how many moments suddenly made sense. Where is it? I asked. Susan closed her eyes. Then she stood and walked upstairs. A minute later, she returned carrying an old yellow envelope. The moment I saw my father's handwriting, my heart broke, because this wasn't a missing document. It wasn't lost, it wasn't misplaced, it had been hidden for 12 years by my wife, the woman I trusted most. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was my father's final will, and everything Carol had told me was true. The family land was never supposed to be sold. My father had created a preservation trust to protect it. He wanted future generations to inherit it together. Not cash, not profits. Legacy. At the bottom of the final page was a handwritten note to you. Wasn't legal language, it was, personal. It was addressed to me, Daniel. If you're reading this, remember that some things are worth more than money. Protect what protects the family. I had to stop reading. For several moments I couldn't speak. Susan sat silently across from me. Eventually I looked up. Why? She wiped tears from her eyes. The developers offered a fortune for the land. I stared at her. She continued. I thought we could use the money. I thought it would help everyone. No. My voice remained calm. You thought you knew better than him. The silence that followed was painful, because we both knew it was true. Over the next several months, attorneys reviewed everything. The will was verified. The estate process had been handled improperly. While the land could not realistically be recovered after so many years, the truth finally came into the open. Our children learned what happened. My sister learned the full story. The entire family learned that my father's wishes had been ignored. The hardest part wasn't losing the land. The hardest part was realizing my wife had hidden the truth because she wanted control over the outcome. It was never really about money. It was about deciding that her judgment mattered more than everyone else's, including my father's, including mine. By the end of that year, I made a decision. I created a new family legacy fund using a large portion of my retirement savings, not for Susan, not for control, for the grandchildren, for education for future generations, and I placed the management of that fund under independent trustees. No single family member would ever control it. Not even me. The lesson had cost too much to ignore. A year later, I sat beside my oldest grandson on a park bench. He asked me why family history mattered so much. I smiled and thought about my father. Then I answered, because when people forget where they came from, they start believing everything belongs to them. He nodded thoughtfully, and for the first time in years, I felt peace. My father had been right. Some things are worth more than money, and sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting something back. It's making sure nobody can take it away again. Susan and I never fully recovered from what happened. Trust, once broken that deeply, doesn't return simply because the truth comes out. But I wasn't interested in punishment anymore. I was interested in understanding. One evening, months later, Susan quietly admitted something she had never said before. I convinced myself I was helping everyone, she said, but the truth is I wanted control. It was the first completely honest thing I had heard from her in years. Nodded. Not because I forgave what happened, but because I finally understood it. My father had never been fighting to protect land. He had been trying to protect a principle. That family should never place money above loyalty. Years later, our grandchildren gathered for a family reunion. I shared stories about my father, his values, and the sacrifices he made for all of us. They listened carefully. They asked questions. They wanted to know where they came from. As I watched them, I realized something important. My father's true legacy had survived, not in property, not in legal documents, but in the lessons he left behind. And in that moment, I finally felt at peace. The will had exposed a painful betrayal, but it had also revealed the truth. Respect cannot be hidden, inherited, or purchased. It has to be earned. And the greatest gift my father ever left me wasn't his estate. It was the wisdom to recognize that difference.